When pale was power. Imagine stepping into a medieval European castle, the torchlight flickering against stone walls, casting long shadows across a great hall. Seated upon a cushioned bench is a noblewoman, her face glowing with an almost supernatural pallor, skin so white it seems to reflect the moonlight streaming through a narrow window. She looks fragile, ethereal, as if a strong gust of wind might carry her away like a dandelion seed. To our modern eyes, she might appear anemic or unwell. But to the people of her time, she was the very definition of beauty. Welcome to the strange, ambitious, and occasionally eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty standards, a world where the goal wasn't to look healthy and robust, but rather like someone who had just been politely exsanguinated. Where a sun-kissed glow wasn't a sign of vitality but a social death sentence. Where women willingly painted their faces with lead-based poison and plucked their hairlines back to their crowns, all in pursuit of an ideal that seems, from our 21st century perspective, absolutely bonkers. But here's the thing about beauty standards, they're never just about beauty. They're about class, morality, power, and identity. They're a language spoken through skin tone and eyebrow shape, through the drape of a veil and the curve of a cheek. And the medieval language of beauty? It was spoken in whispers, through clenched teeth, and often while slowly poisoning oneself in the name of elegance. So before we dive into this fascinating, frightening, and frequently fragrant world, let's set the scene. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Because the path to medieval beauty was paved with good intentions, bad chemistry, and an awful lot of vinegar. In the medieval world, looking pale wasn't a sign that you needed more sleep or iron supplements. It was a fashion statement. A social flex. A silent announcement to the world that said, with all the subtlety of a herald's trumpet, I am too rich to ever see the sun. Thank you very much. Unlike today, where a healthy glow might suggest yoga retreats, green smoothies, or a relaxing trip to the coast, medieval beauty flipped the script entirely. Tan skin. That meant you worked outside. Working outside meant you were poor. Being poor meant, gasp, manual labor. And nothing said, not beautiful, in the 14th century like knowing how to milk a cow or shear a sheep. The logic was impeccable, if deeply inconvenient for anyone with a functioning circulatory system and a tendency to step outdoors. Pale skin was a walking, talking advertisement for a life of leisure. It announced that you had servants to fetch your water, screens to block your windows, and absolutely no need to bend over in a field under the hot sun. The paler you were, the higher your perceived status. It was class warfare fought with complexion. And when we say pale, we don't mean a soft, ivory glow with a hint of peach undertones. We're talking translucent. Porcelain. The kind of skin that looked like it had never encountered a single UV ray in its entire existence. Skin so light it appeared you might have been recently startled by a ghost, or were, in fact, a ghost yourself. We're talking vascular undertones visible at the temples, blue veins painted on for effect, a complexion that whispered, I faint regularly, and meant it as a compliment. Medieval poets, never ones for subtlety, described their ideal women as pale as milk, white as snow, and in one particularly memorable case, like the moon in winter, which is a lovely way of saying she looks like she might expire at any moment and take a sonnet with her. Romantic literature of the period is filled with heroines whose skin is compared to lilies, alabaster, freshly fallen snow, and other things that are notably not exposed to direct sunlight. But here's the problem with nature, it doesn't always cooperate. Especially if you were born with an actual working circulatory system that insisted on sending blood to your cheeks or, heaven forbid, you happen to catch a ray of sunshine while walking between buildings. So medieval Europeans, being nothing if not resourceful, decided to help nature along. Aggressively, achieving that coveted pale complexion required commitment. And by commitment, we mean a slow, decorative form of chemical warfare, on yourself. Enter white lead powder, the medieval equivalent of high-coverage foundation with a side of existential dread. Yes, lead, as in the thing we now seal off in old buildings and warn pregnant women to avoid at all costs. But back in the 14th and 15th centuries, it was considered cutting-edge cosmetic technology. The manufacturing process was simple enough, if you had the stomach for it. Combine vinegar with strips of lead metal, allow the mixture to corrode into a white crust, scrape off said crust, and grind it into a fine powder. Apply daily to face, neck, and any other area requiring that signature corpse chic glow. Bonus, as you achieved the pale, flawless finish of your dreams, you were also slowly absorbing a neurotoxin that would eventually cause hair loss, skin ulcers, chronic fatigue, organ failure, and, if you were really committed to the aesthetic, premature death. But beauty has always had its price. And medieval women were willing to pay it. The result of this daily ritual was a smooth, matte finish that made the skin look absolutely flawless, at least until it started flaking, blistering, or falling off in small, diplomatic chunks. But even that could be spun positively. If your skin began to deteriorate, it meant the makeup was working. Probably. White lead powder wasn't the only option, of course. For those seeking variety in their slow poisoning, there was also vinegar-soaked cloths, applied to the face to bleach the skin through mild chemical burning. Refreshing. Crushed pearls mixed with egg whites, this not only lightened the complexion but also had the delightful side effect of making one's cheeks feel like a stale omelette as the egg white dried and tightened. Chalk dust, for extra staying power and that authentic, I am literally made of calcium carbonate, look. Mercury-based rouge, because why stop at poisoning yourself with one heavy metal when you could diversify your portfolio? The truly dedicated layered their products. First, a base of white lead powder. Then, a carefully applied touch of red pigment on the cheeks, made from things like cinnabar, more mercury, crushed insects, or beetroot juice for the budget-conscious. Finally, a glaze of egg white brushed over the entire face to create a smooth, porcelain-like finish that would crack if you smiled too broadly. Men weren't entirely immune to this trend, either. Some male courtiers, particularly in the later medieval and early Renaissance periods, also used powders and skin treatments. In courts where image mattered almost as much as lineage, or at least as much as smelling less terrible than your rival, a little cosmetic enhancement could go a long way toward securing that lucrative marriage alliance or royal appointment. The church, predictably, had opinions about all of this. Vanity was a sin, after all, and painting one's face was seen by many clergy as an attempt to improve upon God's creation, a theological no-no of the highest order. Preachers thundered against women who plastered their faces like dead walls, and warned that cosmetics were tools of the devil designed to lead men into sin. But such warnings rarely stopped anyone with access to white lead powder and a mirror. If the choice was between dying slowly and being mistaken for a peasant, the nobility often chose the scenic route to the grave. Of all the medieval beauty trends, the obsession with high foreheads may be the most eyebrow-raising. Literally. Because people were removing their eyebrows for it. A tall, smooth, uninterrupted forehead wasn't just fashionable, it was considered elegant, intelligent, and practically divine. It was the architectural marvel of the medieval face, the cathedral vault of cranial real estate. The ideal forehead said, I spend my days reading psalms and looking pensively out of castle windows, not, I own a shovel and know how to use it. To achieve this noble look, women went to extreme and frankly itchy measures. Eyebrows were plucked out completely, every last hair, from bridge to temple, gone. But why stop there? If a truly magnificent forehead was the goal, then the hairline itself needed attention. Women would pluck, thread, or even shave their hairlines back, inch by agonizing inch, to push the boundary of their scalps further toward the crown of their heads. This wasn't a trim. This was a full-on forehead expansion project, requiring the kind of commitment usually reserved for building cathedrals or waging crusades. Medieval grooming manuals, yes, such things existed, advised women on proper forehead enhancement techniques. Recommended tools included tweezers, for basic hair removal, preferably made of metal and wielded with steady hands and a high pain tolerance. Hot cloths, applied to the forehead to soften the skin and loosen hair follicles before plucking. Depilatory creams, made from delightful ingredients like cat dung, quicklime, or vinegar-soaked leeches. Because nothing says, beauty regimen, like applying cat feces to your face in the name of a higher hairline. The results, as depicted in portraits from the period, are striking. Medieval and early Renaissance paintings show women with serene expressions and foreheads so vast you could host a jousting tournament on them. Their faces seem to begin somewhere near the crown of their heads, sloping gently downward through serene eyes and a small, closed-lipped smile before ending in a delicate chin. It's a look that says ethereal to some, alien to others, depending entirely on the lighting and your tolerance for unconventional proportions. Fashion supported this look in ingenious ways. Tight-fitting hoods, wimples, that's the cloth that wraps around the neck and chin, and hennins, those famous cone-shaped hats, all helped pull the hairline up visually, or at least hide the part where your eyebrows used to live. The effect was a seamless expanse of pale skin from brow to crown, uninterrupted by anything as vulgar as actual hair growth. This wasn't just some isolated castle trend either. From England to France to Italy, noblewomen leaned into the high forehead style with enthusiasm. Artists and poets reinforced it by praising women whose faces began somewhere near the top of their heads. Beauty, in the medieval imagination, was elongated, vertical, aspiring upward toward heaven like a Gothic spire. Of course, not everyone could afford the time or tools to pluck themselves into perfection. Hair removal was time-consuming, painful, and required a level of commitment that most working women simply couldn't spare. So, in a moment of medieval ingenuity, some women faked it. They would draw their new, higher hairline slightly above their natural one using pigments, then cover the rest with headbands or veils. That's right, the Middle Ages had their own version of contouring. It just involved a lot more fabric and slightly less blending. In medieval Europe, eyebrows weren't just underappreciated. They were actively eliminated. Modern trends may celebrate bold brows, feathered arches, and TikTok tutorials dedicated to the perfect laminated look. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, eyebrows were seen as unnecessary facial clutter, stubborn weeds in the carefully tended garden of the face. The ideal was a smooth, uninterrupted sweep of pale skin from hairline to eyelid, unmarred by any suggestion of actual hair growth. To achieve this look, women plucked their eyebrows into near non-existence or erased them entirely. Why? Because a bare, smooth forehead was considered elegant and refined, and any sign of actual hair growth interrupted the aesthetic. Eyebrows were basically seen as architectural mistakes on an otherwise perfect facade, something to be removed and forgotten. Some women went even further, shaving the brow area completely to ensure that not a single strand interfered with their alabaster, high-dome glory. It's the sort of commitment that would make modern beauty influencers blink twice, mostly because there were no brow pencils to draw them back in if you changed your mind. Once those hairs were gone, they were gone until they grew back, which could take weeks. It was a bold choice, requiring either tremendous confidence in your aesthetic decisions or a very patient attitude toward regrowth. The tools for brow removal were, shall we say, varied in their sophistication. Tweezers, the standard option, requiring patience, good lighting, and a high tolerance for discomfort. Wax, applied warm to the brow area and ripped away, much like modern waxing but with less quality control and more risk of burning. Pumice stones, yes, literally rubbing stones on your face to remove hair. Exfoliating and depilatory in one. Chemical mixtures, containing quicklime, vinegar, or, for the truly brave, arsenic. Because nothing says dedication to your look like risking mild facial melting. This was more than just a passing fad. Art from the period, from illuminated manuscripts to oil portraits, confirms the trend. Noblewomen are frequently depicted with smooth, browless foreheads and expressionless eyes framed by nothing but skin. The result is either serene or slightly alien, depending on the lighting and your personal tolerance for unconventional beauty standards. Interestingly, the no-brow trend wasn't entirely uniform across Europe. In some regions, particularly those with more cultural exchange with the Middle East and Byzantine Empire, thin or lightly arched brows persisted. Trade routes brought not only spices and silks but also beauty ideals, and what was fashionable in Constantinople didn't always match what was trendy in Paris. But by and large, the message was clear: if people could see your eyebrows, you were doing it wrong. And this wasn't just for women. Men, especially those close to court life, occasionally trimmed or groomed their brows as part of a larger aesthetic of refinement. Full removal was rare among males, unless they'd lost them in a particularly heated theological debate or an unfortunate encounter with quicklime. But a well-groomed brow, thin, arched, barely there, could signal sophistication and courtly refinement. What this all tells us is that medieval beauty ideals weren't about looking natural. They were about looking curated, symbolic, and just a bit angelic. Angels, after all, rarely have eyebrows in religious art. Coincidence? Possibly. But it worked for them. In the Middle Ages, having a touch of color in your cheeks was desirable. But like most things in medieval life, there were rules, social risks, and a vague chance of damnation. The ideal was a subtle blush, the kind of gentle rose hue that suggested you had just heard a mildly scandalous poem, or stepped outdoors for approximately 30 seconds, but not long enough to tan, heaven forbid. A gentle flush on the cheeks suggested youth, fertility, and general survival, all things that were considered attractive, particularly if you could maintain them past the age of 28. But you couldn't look like you were trying. Applying rouge was considered vain, and vanity was suspiciously close to sin. The church was not amused by women smearing color on their faces, unless of course they were nobility, or doing it humbly, which is a theological gray area that scholars are still trying to define. The line between enhancing God's creation and insulting it by suggesting it needed improvement was thin, wiggly, and frequently crossed. Still, women improvised. Common blush ingredients included beetroot juice, readily available, reasonably effective, and with the added benefit of being edible in a pinch. The downside? It could run in the rain, leaving pink streaks down your face like tears of vegetable-based shame. Crushed strawberries or mulberries, also effective, also messy, and also attractive to bees. A flushed cheek was one thing, a cheek covered in hovering insects was quite another. Red ochre, a natural clay pigment that provided longer-lasting color, albeit with a slightly chalky texture. Wine sediment, because if you were going to drink the wine, you might as well wear it too. Cinnabar or red lead, for the wealthy and the suicidal, these mercury and lead-based pigments provided brilliant color and, as a bonus, continued the slow poisoning begun by your white lead foundation. Some women achieved their flush through more mechanical means, pinching their cheeks vigorously before entering a room, or rubbing them with rough cloth to stimulate blood flow. It was free, it was natural, and it carried no risk of eternal damnation, though it did carry the risk of looking like you'd been slapped repeatedly. For the truly dedicated, rouge was applied with cloth, fingers, or whatever tool was available that hadn't just been used to season a stew. Mirror access was limited, especially for women below the nobility, so many relied on instinct, muscle memory, or the occasional honest maid to ensure their blush was properly placed. How do I look? Like a lady of negotiable virtue, milady. Perfect. The goal was always modest enhancement, not theatrical statement. A touch too much color, and you risked accusations of imitating prostitutes, or worse, French courtiers. The horror. If someone complimented your glow, you were expected to deny everything and mutter something about the wind having been particularly brisk that morning. Even nuns occasionally wore a touch of rouge, discreetly and supposedly only on feast days. Because nothing says, "I serve the Lord," like a tasteful dab of beetroot behind the cloister. In medieval Europe, if your hair didn't look like it had been kissed by holy light, or stolen from a bottle labeled "Angel's Glory," you were already starting from behind. Blonde hair, in particular, was the medieval gold standard. It was associated with youth, beauty, virtue, and, in case you needed divine backup, the Virgin Mary was frequently painted as a blonde, even though she was, geographically speaking, almost certainly not. But realism was less important than radiance, and blonde radiated like nothing else. If you were born blonde, congratulations. You were considered blessed by God, probably got out of a few chores, and could expect to be the subject of many romantic poems comparing your tresses to sunlight, wheat fields, and molten gold. But natural blondness didn't last, especially into adulthood. Hair darkens with age, and medieval women faced the same problem as their modern counterparts: how to maintain that youthful, golden glow without the benefit of a salon. So they took matters into their own hands. And sometimes cauldrons. Homemade hair lightening concoctions included saffron, the world's most expensive spice, used to impart a golden yellow tint to hair. Because if you were going to lighten your hair, you might as well bankrupt your family in the process. Chamomile, a more affordable option, brewed into a strong tea and applied repeatedly for gradual lightening. Ash and honey, mixed into a paste and applied to the hair, where the honey produced small amounts of hydrogen peroxide through enzymatic action. Medieval women didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the results. Lye, a harsh alkaline substance made from wood ash, used to strip color from hair with the same gentle touch it used to unclog drains. Urine, collected, aged, and applied to the hair, where the ammonia content helped lighten color. Whose urine? That part was less regulated, but as long as it gave your hair that celestial shimmer, it was deemed worth it. Beauty is, and always has been, a little bit disgusting. These concoctions were applied liberally, then left to bake under the sun in a method known as sunbasking. The process worked best if you had the patience of a nun and the skin of a salamander. Sitting in direct sunlight for hours on end rather defeated the purpose of maintaining that pale complexion, but beauty standards have never been known for their internal consistency. Hair texture mattered too. Loose, long, wavy locks were the ideal, preferably cascading down your back like a divine curtain. But this luxury was reserved for unmarried women. Once you said, "I do," your golden mane was to be hidden under veils, nets, and head wraps. Because apparently the moment you acquired a husband, your hair became a national security risk, capable of inspiring lust, envy, and possibly a small war. For noblewomen, hair was often braided, twisted, or tucked into elaborate styles, especially when attending court or religious events. These hairstyles were frequently accessorized with silk ribbons, beads, or embroidery, just in case you needed to remind the room that you didn't shear sheep for a living. The contrast between the simple, flowing locks of maidens and the complex, covered styles of matrons created a visual language of marital status that everyone could read at a glance. Men weren't left out of the hair obsession either. While not quite as judged as women, men with thick, golden locks were often romanticized in poetry and art. Knights with flowing hair charging into battle were the medieval equivalent of shampoo commercials, heroic, beautiful, and probably not very practical when you're trying to see through your helmet. In medieval Europe, hair was a lot like money. If you had it, you didn't necessarily show it off unless you were trying to get married. Then, suddenly, it became a strategic asset to be deployed with precision. Unmarried women were encouraged to wear their hair long and loose as a symbol of purity and innocence. Long, flowing locks suggested virginity, youth, and availability, the medieval equivalent of a "for sale" sign, albeit one made of carefully washed and perfumed hair. But not too loose, unless you were going for the ethereal forest maiden look, which was only socially acceptable if you were, say, an actual saint or being martyred. Otherwise, a gentle braid would suffice. But once married, your hair was immediately banished from public view. Congratulations, you now had a husband and an obligation to wrap your locks tighter than a monastery's wine budget. Enter the world of veils, wimples, nets, and coifs, a medieval wardrobe of modesty that could make even the most radiant blonde disappear under 3 layers of beige linen. These coverings weren't just modest, they were practical. They protected hair from smoke, lice, and unsolicited compliments from troubadours. They kept you warm in winter and marginally cooler in summer. And they announced to the world, in no uncertain terms, "I am a respectable married woman, and my hair is for my husband's eyes only." The most dedicated women layered their coverings. A coif, a close-fitting cap, might be worn under a veil, which could then be pinned beneath a wimple that wrapped under the chin and covered the neck. The effect? You looked like a pious, well-bundled sandwich, and that was entirely the point. But fashion is rarely satisfied with just function. As time went on, headwear got more elaborate. Nets were embroidered with gold thread. Veils were starched into geometric shapes that defied explanation. Some noblewomen wore silken cages for their braids, accessorized with jewels and tiny bells. Because nothing says subtle beauty like jingling when you turn your head. In many cultures, concealed hair was tied directly to morality. A covered head was seen as modest and virtuous, a sign that a woman understood her place in God's order and her husband's household. Exposed hair on a married woman, however, could get you compared to a lady of the night, or worse, a French woman. The association between loose hair and loose morals was strong enough to keep most married women properly covered, at least in public. Of course, some women rebelled. They would let a little curl slip out from under their veil, or wear translucent fabrics that technically counted as covered while still letting the world admire their carefully dyed strands. Medieval loopholes were alive and well, and where there was a will to be seen, there was a way to be seen while technically obeying the rules. If medieval beauty had one unspoken rule, it was this: taller is nobler. And we're not talking about your legs. By the 15th century, women across Europe began embracing a fashion trend that quite literally elevated their appearance: the hennin. You know the one, those towering, cone-shaped hats that looked like they were designed by someone who spent too much time around church steeples and not enough time considering door frames. The hennin wasn't just headwear. It was a social ladder you wore on your head. These hats could reach upwards of 2 feet in height, sometimes even more, especially among the French and Burgundian elite. The taller the hennin, the higher your status, and the more doors you smacked into on your way to dinner. Made from fine silk, velvet, or brocade stretched over wire frames, hennins had that dangerously aerodynamic shape that suggested their wearers might take flight in a strong wind. A sheer veil usually cascaded from the tip, adding movement, mystery, and a good chance of getting caught in candles. Getting your hair to fit under one of these things was an art in itself. Hair was braided and stuffed up into the cone, or sometimes completely shaved around the forehead real estate again, to help the hennin sit properly. Comfort was not part of the design brief. Hennins were heavy, awkward, and required a specific kind of posture to wear without toppling over. But they were also magnificent, and magnificence was the point. Hennins weren't the only vertical obsession. Some women wore heart-shaped escoffions, which looked like 2 croissants glued to either side of the head. Others favored butterfly hennins, where veils were spread out like wings on either side, great for drama, not so much for rain. The variety was endless, the practicality minimal, and the fashion impact undeniable. Outside of nobility, most women stuck with simpler headwear, veils, linen caps, or circlets. These options were cheaper, less dangerous, and less likely to be mistaken for a siege weapon by visiting armies. But for those who could afford the height, literally and financially, the hennin was the ultimate fashion statement. Clergy and conservative thinkers, as expected, were less than enthused. They warned that such ostentation invited vanity, sin, and possibly neck strain. Sermons thundered against women who built towers on their heads and walked about like peacocks in their pride. But hennins remained popular among those who could afford them, much like most terrible but fashionable ideas throughout history. And while men didn't wear towering cones, they had their own style statements: feathered caps, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that could double as fencing equipment. The medieval love affair with height and verticality extended to male fashion too, just in slightly more practical forms that in medieval times, a woman's ideal body wasn't meant to be athletic, curvy, or toned. No, the goal was to appear delicate, demure, and possibly recovering from a fainting spell. The ideal figure was slim, soft, and slightly ethereal, like someone who lived on honey water, courtly poems, and perhaps one fete per week. Beauty manuals didn't advise women to build strength or endurance. The only lifting expected of you was lifting your veil in a flirtatious gesture before swiftly looking away and possibly swooning. But this wasn't about looking sickly, at least not obviously, The sweet spot was somewhere between too weak to carry a bucket and still able to play the lute while sitting. A graceful, willowy figure was associated with nobility, because of course if you were working, you'd have broader shoulders, stronger arms, and the misfortune of visible muscle tone. The emphasis was on a narrow waist, soft curves, and a general air of spiritual exhaustion. Waistlines on dresses were often cinched just below the bust, an early version of the empire waist, to elongate the torso and give the illusion of height and fragility. And if that illusion needed help, tight lacing was available. Not quite corsets, those came later, but tightly bound cots and girdles did the job just fine, compressing the body into the required shape through sheer mechanical force. Being too thin, however, wasn't the goal either. In times of famine or plague, visible thinness was a red flag, as in, that person might be actively dying. A small hint of roundness, particularly in the face or hips, was considered healthy and fertile. Basically, if you looked like you could survive winter and still be poetic about it, you were in the sweet spot. Diet advice from the time wasn't exactly balanced. Beauty manuals recommended things like eating fennel for digestion and fresh breath, rose petals to sweeten the breath and, presumably, make you smell like a garden, drinking wine to improve complexion and, let's be honest, make the whole medieval experience more bearable. Protein, only if it still had a feather attached, and only in moderation. The goal wasn't fitness, it was fragility. A woman who looked like she could chop wood or plow a field was a woman who looked like she should be doing exactly that, which meant she looked like a peasant. And looking like a peasant was the original sin of medieval beauty. Men, on the other hand, were allowed to have more substance, broad shoulders, strong legs, and the ability to carry a sword without toppling over. But even then, nobility preferred a lean frame with refined posture, not brute strength. A knight should look like he could fight, yes, but also like he'd rather be reading poetry. The ideal was effortless capability, not obvious effort. In the Middle Ages, a woman's eyes were her silent power, the medieval version of sending a flirty emoji, only with more spiritual implications and slightly less blinking. The ideal medieval eyes were large, clear, and soulful, the kind that seemed to whisper, "I'm full of virtue and maybe just a hint of melancholy." Think eyes that looked as if they had personally witnessed the fall of man and were still politely recovering from the experience. Poets of the period couldn't get enough of them. They described eyes as luminous orbs, dewdrops of heaven, or pools of pure devotion. What they rarely said was, bloodshot, allergy-ridden, or I was up all night churning butter. Light-colored eyes, blue or gray, were often idealized in Northern Europe, associated with innocence, purity, and the general assumption that you hadn't seen too many disturbing things, or at least pretended you hadn't. In Southern Europe, darker eyes were admired too, especially if they came paired with a noble lineage and a good dowry. Enhancing the eyes was challenging. There were no medieval eyeliner pens, just charcoal, soot, and optimism. Some women dabbed a little black powder around their lashes to make their eyes look bigger, risking irritation, blurry vision, or starting the world's first accidental smoky eye. But most women relied on nature and strategic lighting. Want to look more wide-eyed? Stand near a candle. Want to look virtuous? Look downward at all times, even if you trip over the cat. Interestingly, slightly teary eyes were admired. They suggested emotional sensitivity, piety, and perhaps that you just finished praying, or reading something uplifting, like a 300-line poem about chastity. Artificial tears weren't available, but staring directly into smoke or enduring mild public humiliation usually did the trick. As for eye contact, it was a delicate dance. Too much could be seen as bold, flirtatious, or suspiciously French. Too little, and you risked seeming shifty or possessed. The trick was to occasionally glance up from beneath lowered lids, like someone who'd memorized the Bible but wasn't about to brag about it. It was a look that said, "I see you, but I'm too virtuous to do anything about it." Let's talk about something rarely mentioned in medieval love poetry, breath. Specifically, what it smelled like. While a knight might wax lyrical about his lady's rosebud lips or pearl-like teeth, he usually skipped over what happened when those lips opened. That's because medieval dental hygiene was, at best, an aspirational concept, and minty freshness hadn't been invented yet, unless you count standing near a herb garden and hoping for the best. Still, fresh breath was technically considered desirable. A gentle, sweet-smelling mouth hinted at youth, health, and that you probably hadn't eaten garlic and eels for breakfast, though statistically, you had. Medieval women did what they could. They chewed parsley, the classic breath freshener, readily available and reasonably effective. Fennel seeds, slightly sweet and aromatic, these were the medieval equivalent of breath mints. Cloves, strong, spicy, and antimicrobial, if you could afford them. Cinnamon sticks, for the wealthy, a luxury breath freshener that also signaled status. Twigs, not just for flavor, but for mechanical cleaning. Chew on a twig long enough, and it would fray into something approximating a toothbrush. These weren't just for taste, they were for survival. A mouth that didn't actively repel others was a mouth that could get closer in conversation, and in a world of arranged marriages, proximity mattered. For those with access to apothecaries, there were also herbal pastes and mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, and myrrh. These were applied sparingly, both because they were expensive and because opening your mouth too wide in public was considered a bit much. A discreet application before important social interactions was the goal. Toothbrushing as we know it wasn't standard. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloth, rubbed them with chalk or crushed herbs, or used chew sticks, small, fibrous twigs that could scrub and double as something to fidget with while your suitor recited bad poetry. And while halitosis wasn't exactly romantic, it wasn't considered shocking either. After all, everyone had bad breath to some degree, and they all had bigger problems, like surviving winter, or avoiding being burned as a heretic. For noblewomen, the trick was to minimize offense while maintaining grace. Conversations took place at arm's length. Public affection was limited. And when in doubt, fan yourself and look contemplative. Bonus points if you carried a small pomander, a scented orb filled with herbs, to wave gently in your own direction as needed. In modern times, a great smile can launch 1,000 dating apps. In the Middle Ages, a smile was a risky endeavor, best used sparingly, like spices or peasant revolts. Why? Well, medieval dental hygiene wasn't exactly flourishing. Teeth were important, yes, but more for chewing bread than charming suitors. Most people had teeth that ranged from slightly questionable to actively terrifying, especially by age 30. So the fewer people saw them, the better. This wasn't entirely due to negligence. Tooth decay was rampant, thanks to diets heavy in bread, porridge, and meat, and lacking in toothbrushes, dental floss, or literally any kind of fluoride. Sugar wasn't widely consumed yet in most of Europe, but even basic starches broke down into tooth-tarnishing acids. Also, dental surgery at the time was essentially an exorcism with pliers, something to be avoided at all costs. Despite this, a healthy smile was quietly admired, just not loudly celebrated. White, even teeth were rare and seen as a mark of youth, fortune, and perhaps a miracle. But people weren't going around flashing big, toothy grins like medieval toothpaste commercials. In fact, a demure, closed-lipped smile was far more fashionable. Think, I might be contemplating a sonnet, rather than, I'm thrilled to be here. Some women even used powders made of sage, salt, or ground-up coral to try to clean or whiten their teeth. These methods were mildly effective and mostly abrasive. Imagine brushing with sand and hoping for the best. But overall, teeth were tolerated, not flaunted. Medieval art, for instance, almost never depicts open-mouthed smiles. Even saints and angels usually keep their mouths politely closed, as if they too were quietly aware of the risks of showing molars. The ideal expression was serene, composed, and slightly distant, a face that suggested inner thoughts too deep for words, rather than external joy too big for restraint. Men weren't immune to dental anxiety either. A knight might win the heart of a lady with his bravery and chiseled jawline, but no ballad ever included the line, "His teeth gleamed like ivory." There's a reason troubadours sang about eyes, hair, and hands, not breath and bite alignment. Some things were best left to the imagination. When it came to medieval beauty standards for men, the expectations were oddly specific. You didn't need to be chiseled like a Greek statue, but you also couldn't look like you'd just fallen off a hay cart. The sweet spot was somewhere between ready to joust and could write a poem about jousting without actually doing it. The ideal man was tall, lean, broad-shouldered, and, very importantly, nobly unbothered. Not overly muscular, that suggested manual labor, but not soft either, that suggested laziness or too much mead. You wanted to look like you could swing a sword, but only if the squire was busy. A defined jawline, high cheekbones, and a straight nose were all considered attractive. Think prints in an illuminated manuscript, rather than village strongmen. A well-groomed beard or a smooth, clean-shaven face was acceptable, depending on the region and era. But either way, it needed to look intentional, not like you'd been lost in the woods for a week and forgotten to shave. In some courts, beards were seen as manly and dignified, in others, they were considered barbaric and unrefined. The key was knowing your audience and grooming accordingly. Hair was typically shoulder-length and styled, especially for noblemen. Curls were in fashion in many courts, especially if they occurred naturally, or looked like they did. Some men even used curling irons. Yes, really. Small heated rods or herbal rinses enhanced texture and shine. Because nothing says, "I'm above manual labor," like sitting for 45 minutes while your page boy styles your fringe. Clothing played a huge role in enhancing the male silhouette. Padded shoulders, cinched waists, and fitted tunics helped create the ideal body shape, with extra emphasis on posture. A nobleman did not slouch. He glided, often with a hint of disdain. And if a man did happen to be naturally muscular, that was fine, as long as he wasn't caught actually working with those muscles. Fighting in wars was acceptable, hauling barrels was not. Above all, the look was effortless. You weren't supposed to try to be attractive. You were simply born noble, and that alone made you appealing, a kind of medieval version of hot without trying, except instead of a gym membership, you inherited land and a falcon. In an era where bathing was technically optional and plumbing was mostly a dream with a Latin name, scent management became an art form. And not the glamorous, walk through a cloud of Chanel No. 5, kind of art, more the mask and pray variety. To be fair, people did bathe, just not as often as we'd hope, especially depending on the century, location, and plague frequency. So to keep from offending nostrils both human and divine, medieval men and women turned to the alchemical power of herbs, oils, and perfume pouches. Let's begin with the pomander, a small, hollow ball made of metal, worn on a chain or pinned to clothing, and filled with strongly scented herbs like cloves, rosemary, cinnamon, sage, and occasionally something ominously labeled, powder of roses. These weren't just for elegance. They were portable smell shields. Think of them as the medieval version of walking around with a Febreze grenade. When unpleasant odors threatened, you simply raised your pomander to your nose and breathed through the herbs. The nobility also favored perfumed gloves, handkerchiefs, and even scented combs. Everything was fair game for aroma enhancement, including hair, which was sometimes doused with floral waters or vinegar infusions that smelled slightly better than sweat and desperation. Speaking of sweat, yes, people absolutely sweated. Medieval garments were heavy, summers were hot, and deodorant was still several centuries away from reinventing armpits. The solution? Layers. Linen undergarments absorbed sweat and could be washed more frequently than the woolen or silk outer garments. Some people added herbal sachets to their underlayers, hoping to combat odor with fragrant optimism. Baths were a thing, especially during the early medieval and late medieval periods, but access varied wildly. Public bathhouses existed in many cities, offering hot water, steam, and sometimes other services that the church frowned upon. The church eventually frowned upon communal nudity in general, which really put a damper on hygiene enthusiasm. So many turned to dry bathing, which is exactly as unrefreshing as it sounds. Wipe yourself with a cloth, then spritz on scented water and pretend that counted. And then there were the overachievers, people who kept flower petals in their shoes, or stuffed herbs in their bed linens, to smell vaguely like someone who had recently seen a garden. It wasn't perfect, but in a world without running water, perfect wasn't on the menu. In medieval Europe, beauty wasn't just skin deep. It was morally loaded. A well-composed face could be a divine blessing, a social weapon, or a trap set by the devil himself. Sometimes all three before breakfast. To be beautiful was to walk a very fine line. On one hand, physical beauty, clear skin, symmetrical features, pale complexion, was considered a sign of virtue. If you were lovely, it meant you were blessed, possibly chosen by God, or at the very least unlikely to steal sheep. Poets, preachers, and painters alike described beauty as evidence of a pure soul, a visible reflection of inner goodness. But there was a catch. If you knew you were beautiful, or worse, if you used that beauty to your advantage, you immediately became suspect. Vanity was a sin, remember? And showing too much interest in one's appearance hinted at pride, seduction, or worst of all, French tendencies. Medieval sermons warned that women's beauty could tempt men into sin, which of course was entirely the woman's fault. Eve set a precedent, and medieval Europe ran with it for a solid 1,000 years. A woman wearing makeup, showing a bit of hair, or fluttering her lashes at the wrong night could easily find herself accused of being everything from immoral to outright demonic. Some even believed that beauty could be an illusion, a sorceress's disguise, a glamour conjured by witches to lead righteous men astray. This may sound dramatic, but remember, this was a time when bad weather could get you burned at the stake. Suspicion ran high, and beauty was not exempt. Conversely, those who were plain or ill-featured were sometimes assumed to be morally deficient, or just unfortunate. The idea that outward appearance reflected inner character wasn't just popular, it was doctrine in some circles. Beauty meant grace. Ugliness meant punishment, illness, or divine disappointment. Of course, all of this made things spectacularly confusing. Be beautiful, but don't try too hard. Glow with virtue, but not so much that it looks like pride. And above all, never look more attractive than the local lord's wife. That was a one-way ticket to a silent convent or an unusually convenient illness. So in the end, medieval beauty standards weren't just about aesthetics. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, balancing vanity, virtue, and whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup kit. To be beautiful was to be blessed, and to be cursed, all at the same time. They were a full-blown moral tightrope, balancing vanity, virtue, and whatever powdered lead was left in your makeup kit. To be beautiful was to be blessed, and to be cursed, all at the same time. The Forgotten Warriors. History, as they say, is written by the victors. But it's also written by men. And when men write history, women who wielded swords, led armies, and spilled blood on the battlefield often find themselves edited out, mythologized into harmless legends, or reduced to footnotes in the stories of their fathers, husbands, and sons. But make no mistake, warrior women have been there all along. Across continents, across centuries, across cultures, women have picked up weapons and fought. Not as exceptions, not as anomalies, but as warriors in their own right. They rode horses into battle, they led rebellions against empires, they commanded troops and struck fear into the hearts of enemies who underestimated them at their peril. In this section, we'll journey across the ancient and medieval world to meet these women. From the frozen steppes of Siberia to the tropical forests of West Africa, from the islands of Japan to the deserts of the American Southwest, we'll uncover the stories of women who refused to stay in the shadows. Some became queens and generals. Others were peasants who rose through sheer courage and skill. All of them shattered the lie that war belonged to men alone. So sharpen your swords, string your bows, and prepare to meet the women who fought back, not just against enemies, but against history itself. Before there were legends of Greek Amazons, there were the Scythians, nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, feared and respected from the Black Sea to the Altai Mountains. And in Scythian society, women didn't just stay behind the tents, weaving cloth and raising children. They rode horses, wielded bows, and went to war. And they didn't just accompany men into battle, they led, and they fought with lethal skill. These were not exceptions. This was the culture. When the Greek historian Herodotus encountered these women in the 5th century BCE, he was genuinely stunned. He described entire tribes where women refused to marry unless they had first killed an enemy in combat. His words, originally intended as exotic curiosities for his Greek readers, have since found archaeological proof that would make any modern historian sit up and take notice. Scattered across the vast landscape of Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and southern Russia are burial mounds called kurgans. These ancient tombs have yielded astonishing finds, the skeletons of young women buried with bows, arrows, swords, and even battle-inflicted injuries. One such discovery revealed a woman with an arrowhead lodged in her spine, her body armored, her grave richly furnished with weapons and horse trappings. These weren't ceremonial weapons placed for symbolic reasons. They had been used. And so had she. Scythian society was fundamentally different from its contemporaries in the settled civilizations of Greece, Persia, and Egypt. Life on the steppe demanded mobility and resilience. Everyone, male or female, had to ride, hunt, and defend the tribe. There was no room for the kind of rigid gender segregation that characterized the urban centers of the Mediterranean. Girls learned archery as young as boys did. They were taught to ride before they could walk, practically, strapped to the backs of horses as infants and growing into skilled equestrians by childhood. They wore the same leather trousers, the same armor. They even wore their hair and tattoos in similar fashion, making them nearly indistinguishable from their male counterparts on horseback under a storm of arrows. This created a warrior culture where gender roles were fluid on the battlefield but strict off it. A Scythian woman could be deadly at full gallop, loosing arrows with terrifying accuracy while her horse thundered across the grass. Then she could return home and fulfill whatever ritual or maternal duties her society expected. The two roles were not in conflict. They were complementary, two sides of the same survival coin. The Greeks, encountering these fierce horsewomen during their colonization of the Black Sea coast, were both fascinated and horrified. They told stories of the Amazons, a mythical race of warrior women who supposedly lived at the edge of the known world. These Amazons, in Greek telling, cut off one breast to better draw their bows, a complete anatomical impossibility that says more about Greek anxiety than Amazon reality, and lived apart from men, meeting them only for procreation. Modern scholarship suggests that the Amazon myths were likely inspired by exaggerated encounters with real Scythian women. Greek traders and soldiers, accustomed to women who stayed in the home and spun wool, simply couldn't process what they were seeing. Women who fought. Women who rode as well as men. Women who killed. These must be mythical creatures, they decided. Amazons from the edge of the world. But while the Amazons of myth vanished into fantasy, the Scythians were real. They fought the Persians and gave Darius the Great serious trouble. They clashed with Greek colonists and terrified the Macedonians under Alexander's successors. And for centuries, they roamed the steppe with fire and fury, men and women alike, bound by a shared culture of horse, bow, and survival. The legacy of these warrior women extends beyond their own time. DNA analysis of Scythian burial sites continues to reveal that a significant percentage of warrior graves contain female skeletons. The image of the steppe nomad as exclusively male is crumbling under the weight of archaeological evidence. These women were real, they were common, and they were terrifying. In the small West African kingdom of Dahomey, modern-day Benin, an army of women once struck fear into European colonizers, rival kingdoms, and anyone foolish enough to underestimate them. They were known as the Agogi, but the French, encountering them in the 19th century, nicknamed them the Dahomey Amazons, comparing them to the legendary warrior women of Greek myth. But these warriors were very, very real. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the Agoji had become the standing royal guard of Dahome's king. But they weren't just guards. They were elite infantry, trained to kill, to defend, and to never, ever retreat. They were the frontline shock troops of one of the most powerful kingdoms in West Africa, and they were absolutely lethal. The origins of the Agoji are somewhat murky. They may have started as elephant hunters, a dangerous profession that required skill, courage, and complete fearlessness. Or they may have begun as palace attendants, women tasked with guarding the king's quarters who gradually took on broader military roles. Whatever their origins, by the time European observers started writing about them, they had evolved into a formal, feared military force with thousands of members. Recruitment into the Agoji was both voluntary and conscripted. Young girls were chosen for their strength, spirit, and potential, sometimes volunteered by families seeking status and royal favor, sometimes simply selected by palace officials. Once chosen, they were separated from their families and placed into an intense training regimen that would break most modern soldiers. Discipline was total. They ran obstacle courses filled with thorns to build endurance and pain tolerance. They sparred with real blades, not wooden practice weapons, because a wound in training was better than death in battle. They swore oaths of celibacy and absolute loyalty to the king, becoming, in effect, married to the state. No man could touch them. No family could claim them. They belonged to Dahomey and Dahomey alone. Their equipment was a mix of traditional African weapons and modern firearms acquired through trade with Europeans. They carried muskets when available, but also machetes, clubs, and specialized blades designed for close combat. They wore uniforms, braided sashes, cloth wraps, and sometimes ammunition belts crisscrossing their chests. Their heads were often shaved or closely cropped, both for practicality and to prevent enemies from grabbing hair in hand-to-hand fighting. But their deadliest weapon was psychological. European observers during the 19th century were repeatedly shocked by their fearlessness and brutality. One French officer noted with visible unease how a Dahomey Amazon rushed forward, ripped open a man's throat with a single slash, then calmly wiped her blade and looked for the next target. These were not symbolic warriors or ceremonial guards. They were frontline troops used in raids, battles, and ambushes. During the Franco-Dahomean Wars in the 1890s, the Agoji went toe-to-toe with French colonial troops equipped with modern rifles, artillery, and machine guns. Outnumbered and outgunned, they still launched night raids, executed devastating ambushes, and fought street by street to defend their kingdom. Their tenacity forced French commanders to completely rethink their tactics, and their assumptions about gender in combat. One French officer wrote in his memoirs, "These women fight with a desperation that is almost supernatural. They do not retreat. They do not surrender. They advance into machine gun fire as if death means nothing to them." Another noted, "I have seen many battles in many lands, but never have I faced warriors like these. They are not women. They are something else entirely." But it wasn't just their battlefield success that mattered. The Dahomey Amazons existed in a deeply patriarchal world. West Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries was no feminist utopia, and yet they carved out a space of total autonomy and influence. They advised kings on matters of state. They performed ceremonial duties that shaped the kingdom's religious life. They influenced foreign policy, not from behind. The scenes, whispering in ears, but with blades in hand, standing in the front ranks of the army. Though the French ultimately defeated Dahomey in 1894, incorporating it into their colonial empire, the legend of the Agoji never died. Their stories were passed down through generations, told and retold around cooking fires and at family gatherings. In recent decades, their legacy has been reclaimed and celebrated, inspiring everything from academic studies to fictional representations. The Dora Milaje in Marvel's Black Panther, the all-female royal guard of Wakanda, were directly inspired by the Dahomey Amazons. But as with so many warrior women, the truth is more impressive than fiction. The Agoji weren't superheroes with vibranium weapons and advanced technology. They were real women, armed with muskets and machetes, who charged into machine gun fire because their kingdom needed them to. And that kind of courage needs no fictional enhancement that in the shadowy pages of Japan's medieval history, one woman rides through blood and legend alike, Tomoe Gozen, a samurai warrior of the late 12th century. She fought during the Genpei War, a brutal civil conflict between the Minamoto and Taira clans that gave birth to the first shogunate and shaped Japanese culture for centuries to come. Tomoe wasn't a symbolic figure or a passive consort. She was a commander, a swordswoman, and an archer trained in the deadly arts of the battlefield. She was feared for her precision in combat and respected for her tactical mind. In a society that would later rigidly codify gender roles and exclude women from formal military service, Tomoe stands as a spectacular exception, or perhaps as evidence that such roles were more fluid in earlier periods than we usually assume. Her story emerges most famously from the tale of the Haika, a war epic that blends historical events with poetic flair and legendary embellishment. In it, Tomoe is described in terms that reveal both her beauty and her lethality, especially beautiful, with white skin, long hair, and charming features. But the next sentence drops the real thunder: she was also a remarkably strong archer, and as a swordswoman she was a warrior worth 1,000. Beauty and lethality weren't contradictions in this description, they were fused into a single, terrifying package. Tomoe served under Minamoto no Yashinaka, a warlord and her possible lover, during his campaign to seize control of Kyoto, the imperial capital. She wasn't a camp follower or a battlefield nurse, hovering at the edges of the action. She was in the thick of it, reportedly leading troops, commanding units, and even slaying multiple enemies in single combat. When Yashinaka's forces clashed with rivals, Tomoe was there, cutting down warriors who had trained their entire lives for such moments. At the Battle of Awazu in 1184, facing encirclement by rival Minamoto forces, Yashinaka made his last stand. The situation was hopeless, his army was shattered, his cause lost. Rather than flee, Tomoe chose to fight. In one of her most famous encounters, she's said to have spotted a charging enemy horseman, a powerful warrior named Uchida Yayoshi. She rode to meet him, dodged his attack, wrestled him from his horse, and calmly beheaded him on the ground. She then remounted, shook the blood from her blade, and continued into the chaos. That moment, possibly embellished by later storytellers, possibly true, has endured for centuries as a symbol of her unmatched composure and skill. Here was a woman, surrounded by enemies, facing certain death, and she didn't flinch. She didn't run. She didn't beg for mercy. She fought, and she killed, and she kept fighting. But what happened to Tomoe after the battle remains a mystery. The historical sources disagree. Some say she was captured and forced into marriage with a powerful warrior. Others claim she became a nun, retreating into silence and prayer, her fighting days over. Still others believe she vanished like a ghost back into the mists of legend, wounded but alive, disappearing into the countryside to live out her days in obscurity. Whatever the truth of her fate, the legacy of Tomoe Gozen survived. She appears in no theater, in kabuki performances, in folk tales and national memory. In a society that would later become famous for its rigid gender roles and patriarchal control, Tomoe stood apart, blade drawn, head high, utterly unafraid. She wasn't just fighting for her lord in that final battle. She was fighting for her right to exist in a world that told her she shouldn't. In the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire was at its peak, disciplined, organized, and seemingly unstoppable. Its legions had conquered Gaul, crushed Carthage, and turned the Mediterranean into a Roman lake. But then came Boudica, a flame-haired Celtic queen from Britannia who nearly brought the Roman machine to its knees. Her name would echo through history as a symbol of raw vengeance, national pride, and the terrifying force of a woman with nothing left to lose. Boudica was the wife of Prasutagus, king of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England. He was a client king under Rome, a puppet ruler allowed to maintain local power as long as he kept the peace and paid his taxes. It was a common arrangement. Rome preferred to rule through compliant local elites rather than administer every conquered territory directly. But when Prasutagus died, everything changed. In his will, he He had attempted to preserve his kingdom by leaving half his wealth to the Emperor Nero and half to his 2 daughters, a diplomatic gesture designed to buy Roman favor while keeping his family in power. Rome ignored the will entirely. Roman officials moved to seize the Iceni lands outright, treating the kingdom as conquered territory rather than allied client state. And then things got much, much worse. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, Roman officials flogged Boudica publicly, a humiliating punishment normally reserved for slaves and the lowest classes. Her daughters, still young, were raped by Roman soldiers. It was a brutal, calculated humiliation designed to crush any thought of rebellion and teach the Iceni their place in the Roman order. Instead, it lit a wildfire. In 60 or 61 CE, Boudica united several British tribes, the Iceni, the Trinovans, and others, and launched one of the most ferocious revolts in Roman history. And she wasn't just a figurehead, a symbolic leader while men did the actual fighting. Roman accounts describe her leading her army from a chariot, spear in hand, dressed in a flowing tunic and a massive gold torque around her neck. Her fiery red hair streamed behind her as she rode along the battle lines, calling her people to war. She was part priestess, part general, and all fury. Her forces descended on Camulodunum, modern Colchester, a Roman colony and center of administration. The city was burned to the ground, its inhabitants slaughtered. Next came Londinium, the seat of modern London. Boudica's army fell upon it with equal ferocity, killing Roman colonists and Britons who had collaborated with the occupiers. The city was razed. The same fate befell Verulamium, modern St. Albans. Historians estimate that over 70,000 Romans and their British sympathizers were killed in just a few months. The rebellion left a trail of ash and shattered arrogance across the province. Rome's grip on Britain seemed to be collapsing. But the Romans under Governor Gaius Suetonius Paulinus were not finished. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they regrouped and chose their ground carefully. Suetonius selected a narrow battlefield where his smaller, more disciplined force could fight without being enveloped. When the two armies met, Roman discipline and formation tactics proved decisive against the wild charge of the British warriors. Boudica's forces were slaughtered. According to Tacitus, she escaped the battlefield but faced defeat and certain capture. Rather than be paraded through Rome as a trophy, she is said to have taken poison, ending her life on her own terms. Though her rebellion failed, Boudica's legacy only grew. Roman historians, even as they condemned her as a barbarian, couldn't help but acknowledge her courage and leadership. Tacitus, no friend to rebels, put a speech in her mouth that has echoed through the ages: "We British are used to women commanders in war. I am fighting for my lost freedom, my bruised body, and my outraged daughters. Consider how many of you are fighting and why. Then you will win this battle, or perish. That is what I, a woman, plan to do. Let the men live in slavery if they will." For the British, especially in later centuries, Boudica became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, both foreign and domestic. Queen Victoria was compared to her, a comparison Victoria apparently enjoyed. Suffragists adopted her as a symbol of women's power. Statues were erected in her honor, most famously on the Thames Embankment in London, where she rides her chariot into eternity, daughters beside her, forever charging against an enemy that has long since turned to dust. In the war-ravaged steppes of Central Asia during the golden age of Mongol expansion, there emerged a woman who terrified warriors and embarrassed princes, not with a sword, but with sheer physical dominance. Her name was Kutulan, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of none other than Genghis Khan. But she didn't just ride in his shadow. She carved out a legend of her own, one headlock at a time. Born around 1260 CE, Kutulan was the daughter of Kaidu Khan, a powerful cousin of Kublai Khan and a rival claimant to leadership in the Mongol Empire. While Kublai ruled China and pursued a more settled, Chinese-style emperorship, Kaidu held to the old ways, the nomadic life of the steppe, with its horses, yurts, and constant movement. And he raised his daughter in that tradition. Kutulan was trained from childhood as a warrior prince would be, in archery, horse riding, and battlefield tactics. She could shoot a moving target from a galloping horse before most children her age could write their names. She could ride for days without rest and fight without hesitation. But what she stood out for most was her talent in wrestling, a deeply respected and highly competitive sport among the Mongols, who valued physical strength as much as military skill. According to the Persian historian Rashid al-Din, who wrote about the Mongol Empire in detail, Kutulan made a bold vow: she would only marry a man who could beat her in a wrestling match. Many tried. All failed. The challenge attracted suitors from across the Mongol world and beyond. Princes, warriors, champions, they came one after another, each confident that they could defeat a mere woman. One by one, they walked away defeated and humiliated. Some even wagered horses, gold, or entire herds on their chances, adding to the stakes. It's said that Kutulan amassed 10,000 horses from her victories, turning her into not just an undefeated champion but one of the wealthiest women on the steppe. But Kutulan wasn't just tossing men onto the dirt for fun. She fought alongside her father in real battles, commanding troops and breaking enemy lines with her skill and courage. During campaigns against both rival Mongol factions and Chinese forces, Kutulan was Kaidu's most trusted military advisor. He valued her counsel, respected her judgment, and relied on her in moments of crisis. She was, by all accounts, brilliant at strategy and devastating in execution. Kaidu was so impressed with his daughter that he reportedly considered naming her as his successor, an unprecedented move in a culture dominated by male warlords and patrilineal inheritance. This unsurprisingly sparked massive backlash. Mongol nobles whispered that her influence was unnatural, her power too threatening. Some questioned her fitness to rule simply because of her gender. Others may have genuinely feared what would happen to the established order if a woman took the reins of one of the most powerful factions in the Mongol Empire. In the end, Kaidu didn't make her his heir. Whether he bowed to political pressure or simply changed his mind, he chose a male relative instead. But Kutulan's reputation endured. Even Marco Polo, who traveled through the Mongol Empire during this period and wrote extensively about what he saw, mentioned her. He described a Mongol princess who fought like a tiger, rode like the wind, and could shoot as well as any man, a figure who clearly made an impression on the Venetian traveler. Later histories tried to romanticize or minimize her, turning her into a lovesick figure pining for a man who could finally defeat her, or reducing her story to colorful legend. But make no mistake, Kutulan was real, and her strength was legendary. She proved that in the heart of the most male-dominated empire on earth, a woman could still rise, not because she was allowed to, but because no one could stop her. In a time when women couldn't vote, couldn't own land freely, and couldn't even wear men's clothing without risking arrest, one French teenager not only wore armor, she led armies. Joan of Arc, born in 1412 in the tiny village of Domremy, was an illiterate peasant girl. But by the age of 17, she would command troops, confront kings, and bend the course of the 100 Years' War between France and England. Her rise wasn't born from military training or noble lineage. Joan didn't study tactics under famous generals or learn swordplay from champion duelists. Instead, she claimed divine inspiration. She said she heard voices, those of Saints Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, who told her that she had been chosen by God to drive the English from France and crown Charles the Dauphin as king. It was a wild claim, the kind that could have, and probably should have, gotten her dismissed as mad, locked away, or worse. A teenage peasant girl, a nobody from nowhere, claiming direct communication with saints and a divine mission to save France. The skepticism must have been overwhelming. Instead, it got her an audience with the future King Charles VII. The court tested her. Clergy grilled her for weeks, asking theological questions designed to trip her up. They sent investigators to her village to interview everyone who had known her since childhood. They looked for any sign of heresy, madness, or demonic influence. And somehow, impossibly, she passed. They saw something in her, conviction, charisma, an unshakable certainty that was either divine inspiration or the most convincing act they'd ever encountered. Charles, desperate for any hope in a seemingly hopeless war, decided to take a chance. He equipped Joan with armor, a banner, and a small military escort, and sent her to Orleans, a besieged city that symbolized the war's turning point. If Orleans fell, France would almost certainly fall with it. French commanders were deeply skeptical. They had been fighting for years, losing more often than winning. Now they were supposed to follow a teenage girl who had never seen combat. The potential for disaster was enormous. But Joan's mere presence revitalized their spirit. She didn't just stand on the sidelines and offer moral support. She led charges, braving arrows and cannon fire. She rallied troops when they faltered, shouting encouragement and planting her banner where the fighting was thickest. Against all odds, and against every military expectation, the French lifted the siege. The victory electrified France. Joan became known as the Maid of Orleans, a symbol of divine favor and patriotic resistance. Soldiers who had been ready to give up now believed they could win. The tide of the war, which had favored England for a generation, began to turn. After a string of victories, Joan escorted Charles to Reims, where he was crowned king exactly as her voices had foretold. It was the high point of her extraordinary career, a peasant girl standing beside her king at his coronation, having fulfilled her divine mission. But power, fame, and miracles come with enemies. In 1430, during a skirmish near Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian forces, French allies of the English. They sold her to their English allies, who were eager to eliminate the symbol of French resurgence. Tried by a pro-English ecclesiastical court, Joan faced accusations of heresy, witchcraft, and, notably, wearing male clothing, which was considered a violation of divine law and a crime punishable by death. Throughout her trial, she displayed the same courage and quick which she had shown on the battlefield, confounding her interrogators and refusing to betray her voices. But the outcome was predetermined. On May 30, 1431, just 19 years old, Joan was burned alive in Rouen marketplace. According to witnesses, she asked for a cross to hold as the flames rose around her. An English soldier, moved by pity, fashioned a small cross from 2 sticks of wood and handed it to her. Her last word, repeated over and over, was, "Jesus." Her death, however, only magnified her legend. 25 years later, the church reopened her case and declared her innocent of all charges. In 1920, she was canonized as a saint, the same institution that had burned her for heresy now declaring her one of God's chosen. Joan of Arc remains one of history's most extraordinary figures. A peasant girl who couldn't read or write, she changed the course of a war, crowned a king, and inspired a nation. She proved that leadership doesn't require noble birth or male anatomy, only courage, conviction, and the willingness to die for what you believe. By the time Nakano Takiko took up her naginata, the bladed polearm favored by samurai women, Japan was changing fast. It was the late 1860s, and the samurai class was being systematically dismantled as the country modernized under pressure from Western powers. The feudal system that had defined Japan for centuries was crumbling. But in one final stand for the old ways, this young woman would write herself into history as the last true Onabugeisha, female warrior of the samurai tradition. Nakano Takiko was born in 1847 into a respected family of scholars and warriors. From a young age, she studied the Confucian classics, calligraphy, and, most importantly, martial arts. Her favorite weapon, the naginata, was more than just practical. It was symbolic. Traditionally used by women of the samurai class, it allowed for extended reach and graceful, fluid combat that compensated for the generally smaller size and lesser upper body strength of female fighters. Under the guidance of her adoptive father, a martial arts master, Takiko trained until her skill rivaled that of the best men in her domain. She could spin the naginata in devastating arcs, cutting down opponents before they could get close enough to use their swords effectively. She could fight for hours without tiring, her movements precise and deadly. By her 20s, Takiko had become both an educator and a warrior, teaching other women the ways of the sword while continuing to hone her own skills. But in 1868, when the Boshin War broke out, a civil conflict between the imperial forces seeking to modernize Japan and the old Tokugawa shogunate loyal to tradition, Takiko didn't stay behind. She joined the defense of Aizu, one of the last bastions of traditional samurai resistance. Women were not officially allowed to serve in combat roles, but Takiko didn't let that stop her. She formed an unofficial unit of female fighters known as the Joshitai, the Women's Army. Clad in hakama pants and traditional armor, these women fought fiercely alongside the men, protecting their families, their city, and their way of life. At the Battle of Aizu, Takiko led her unit in hand-to-hand combat against imperial troops armed with modern rifles. According to witnesses, she killed several enemies before being shot in the chest. The wound was mortal, and she knew it. Unwilling to be captured or defiled by enemy soldiers, she asked her sister to behead her, a final act of control in a situation where she had lost everything else. Her sister complied, honoring Takiko's last wish. Her body was buried at a temple in Fukushima, her naginata placed beside her in the grave. She was just 21 years old. Today, statues of Takiko stand in Japan, particularly in Aizu, where she's remembered not only as a warrior but as a woman who refused to bow to modernity, to patriarchy, or to death itself. Her story represents the end of an era, the last gasp of the samurai tradition before Japan transformed into a modern industrial power. But it also represents something timeless, the courage to stand and fight for what you believe, regardless of the odds. In the smoldering ruins of World War II, one name sent shivers down the spines of German soldiers on the Eastern Front, Lyudmila Pavlichenko, nicknamed Lady Death by her enemies. She wasn't a myth, a morale booster, or a propaganda figure, she was the real thing. A Soviet sniper who tallied 309 confirmed kills, including 36 enemy snipers. She was the most lethal female sniper in recorded history, and arguably one of the deadliest snipers of any gender in any war. Born in 1916 in what is now Ukraine, Pavlichenko was competitive from a young age. She was fiercely patriotic and a natural marksman, excelling in shooting sports as a teenager. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, she was just 24 years old and studying history at university. But instead of books, she picked up a rifle and volunteered for the Red Army. Officials initially suggested she become a nurse, the traditional role for women in wartime. She refused. She wanted a combat role, and she got one, despite the skepticism of male commanders who doubted a woman could handle the physical and psychological demands of frontline combat. Deployed to the front lines during the siege of Odessa and later the siege of Sevastopol, Pavlichenko earned her reputation the hard way. She spent long hours motionless, camouflaged in freezing terrain, waiting for the perfect shot. Her targets weren't just foot soldiers. She hunted officers, the men who led the enemy and whose deaths would cause the most disruption. She hunted machine gunners, whose fire pinned down Soviet troops. And she hunted rival snipers, engaging in deadly cat-and-mouse games that could last for days. She operated with nerves of steel, patience bordering on supernatural, and an absolute, burning hatred for the invaders who had attacked her homeland. Her kill count climbed so high that Soviet commanders eventually realized she was too valuable to risk in frontline combat. They pulled her from the front and sent her on a diplomatic tour of the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, part of an effort to convince the Western Allies to open a second front in Europe. In America, Pavlichenko became an unlikely celebrity. She met President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House and formed a friendship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who admired her composure and intellect. She gave speeches to huge crowds, urging the Allies to take the war to Germany and mocking reporters who asked her sexist questions about makeup and skirt length. At one press conference, when asked about such topics, she replied with characteristic directness, "Gentlemen, I am 25 years old and I have killed 309 fascist occupants. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" The room fell silent. The message was received. After the war, Pavlichenko didn't retreat into obscurity. She earned her university degree, became a historian, and trained future generations of Soviet snipers. Though she suffered from war-related trauma and injuries, including wounds that would trouble her for the rest of her life, her legacy endured. She received the Hero of the Soviet Union Medal, the country's highest honor, and remains a national hero in both Russia and Ukraine. In a world that often doubts the place of women in combat, Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply did the job better than almost anyone who ever lived, man or woman. Before Boudica, before Joan of Arc, before any of the warrior women of European legend, there were the Trung sisters of Vietnam. Trung Trac and Trung Nhi led a rebellion against Chinese occupation in the 1st century CE, riding elephants into battle, rallying thousands of followers, and ruling an independent state for 3 years before being crushed by superior Chinese forces. Their resistance is still commemorated today with temples and festivals in their honor, even though global history books have largely forgotten them. In 40 CE, Vietnam, then known as Nam Viet, had been under Chinese rule for over a century. The Han dynasty administered the territory harshly, imposing Chinese laws, language, and culture on the Vietnamese people. Taxes were crushing. Local leaders were executed or replaced with Chinese appointees. Resistance was met with brutal suppression. According to Vietnamese tradition, the spark that ignited the rebellion was personal. Trung Trac's husband, T. Sach, was a local lord who opposed Chinese rule. The Chinese governor, angry at his resistance, had him executed. Trung Trac, fueled by grief and rage, vowed revenge. Together with her sister Trung Nhi, she raised an army. Thousands flocked to their banner, not just men, but women too. Vietnamese tradition holds that 36 women served as generals under the Trung sisters, leading troops in battle. The army grew to tens of thousands, sweeping through the Chinese garrisons and driving the occupiers out of 65 citadels. Trung Trac declared herself queen, establishing a capital at My Linh and ruling an independent Vietnam for 3 years. It was a golden age of freedom, brief, but deeply meaningful to a people who had been subjugated for generations. But the Han Empire could not tolerate an independent Vietnam on its southern border. In 43 CE, Emperor Guangwu sent his best general, Ma Yuan, with a massive army to crush the rebellion. The Chinese forces were better equipped, better trained, and far more numerous. The Vietnamese fought desperately, but the outcome was inevitable. According to legend, rather than be captured, the Trung sisters drowned themselves in the Hat River. They chose death over submission, a final act of defiance that would echo through Vietnamese history for 2,000 years. Today, the Trung sisters are honored as national heroes throughout Vietnam. Temples dedicated to them dot the countryside. Their story is taught to every Vietnamese schoolchild. Streets are named after them. They appear on currency and in art. For the Vietnamese people, they represent the eternal spirit of resistance, the refusal to bow to foreign domination, no matter the odds. And their legacy extends beyond Vietnam. The Trung sisters were among the first documented female military leaders in world history, predating Boudica by 20 years and Joan of Arc by 14 centuries. They proved that women could lead armies, inspire nations, and challenge empires, a lesson that the world is still learning. At the dawn of the 20th century, as European powers scrambled to carve up Africa among themselves, one woman stood in the way of the British Empire. Her name was Yasantua, Queen Mother of the Ajisu in the Ashanti Empire, modern-day Ghana. And when the British demanded the most sacred object in Ashanti culture, the golden stool, symbol of the nation's soul, she refused to bow. The Ashanti Confederacy was one of the most powerful states in West Africa, with a sophisticated government, a powerful military, and a rich cultural tradition. The golden stool, according to legend, had descended from the heavens in a cloud of white dust and settled on the knees of the first Ashanti king. It embodied the soul of the nation, so sacred that no one, not even the king, was allowed to sit on it. The British, expanding their colonial control in the region, saw the Ashanti as an obstacle. In 1896, they exiled the Ashanti king and demanded the golden stool as a sign of submission. When Ashanti leaders hesitated, the British governor Frederick Hodgson famously declared that he would sit on the stool himself, an unspeakable insult to Ashanti sovereignty and spirituality. The Ashanti chiefs gathered to discuss their response. Should they fight? Should they negotiate? The men argued among themselves, uncertain, fearful of British military power. Nyasantua, present at the meeting, rose to speak. Her words, preserved in Ashanti oral tradition, cut through the indecision. Now I have seen that some of you fear to fight for our king. If it were in the brave days of Osei Tutu, Okomfo Anakai, and Opoku where, chiefs would not sit down to see their king taken away without firing a shot. No European could have dared speak to chiefs of the Ashanti in the way the governor spoke to you this morning. Is it true that the bravery of the Ashanti is no more? I cannot believe it. It cannot be. I must say this, if you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight until the last of us falls on the battlefield. The speech electrified the assembly. The chiefs, shamed by her words and inspired by her courage, committed to fight. And Nyasantua didn't just send the men off to war, she led the resistance herself, commanding Ashanti forces in what became known as the War of the Golden Stool. For months, the Ashanti fought a guerrilla campaign against British forces. They knew the terrain, they had local support, and they were fighting for something far more precious than territory or treasure, they were fighting for their soul. Nyasantua proved herself a capable strategist, coordinating attacks and inspiring her fighters to continue despite British advantages in firepower and supplies. But ultimately, superior British weaponry and resources told. Nyasantua was captured in 1901 and exiled to the Seychelles, where she died in 1921. She never saw her homeland again. But she had made her point. The British never did sit on the golden stool. It remains hidden to this day, a symbol of Ashanti sovereignty and resistance. And Nyasantua's legacy as one of Africa's greatest freedom fighters endures, celebrated in songs, stories, and statues throughout Ghana. For centuries, the Viking Age has captured the popular imagination, longships, raids, sagas, and warriors. But for most of that time, the image of the Viking warrior was exclusively male. Recent archaeological discoveries have shattered that assumption, proving what the sagas hinted at all along: Viking women fought. The evidence comes from burial sites across Scandinavia. At Birka, Sweden, one of the most famous Viking graves ever discovered, grave BJ 581, was long assumed to be the resting place of a high-status male warrior. The grave contained an impressive array of weapons: a sword, an axe, a spear, armor-piercing arrows, and 2 horses. This was clearly a professional warrior, someone who had fought and trained for battle. In 2017, DNA analysis revealed the truth: the skeleton in grave BJ 581 was female. The warrior was a woman. This wasn't an isolated find. Across the Viking world, female graves containing weapons have been documented. At a site in Norway, a woman was buried with a sword, shield, and spear. In Denmark, another female grave contained an axe. The evidence suggests that while not all Viking women were warriors, any more than all Viking men were, some certainly were. The Icelandic sagas, written down centuries after the Viking Age but preserving older oral traditions, describe these shield maidens. Perhaps the most famous is Lagertha, a legendary Viking shield maiden who appears in the writings of Saxo Grammaticus. According to Saxo, Lagertha fought alongside the famous Viking Ragnar Lothbrok, saving his life in battle and earning his admiration. She later became a ruler in her own right, commanding ships and warriors. Other sagas mention Hervair, who inherited a cursed sword from her father and lived as a warrior, defying those who told her such a life was unsuitable for a woman. And there's Freydis Eriksdottir, daughter of Eric the Red, who according to the sagas took up a sword and fought off Native Americans during the Viking attempt to settle Vinland, Newfoundland. Were these figures historical or legendary? The line between history and myth in the sagas is blurry at best. But the archaeological evidence suggests that the idea of female warriors wasn't just fantasy, it was rooted in a reality where some Viking women did pick up weapons and fight. The Viking world was harsh and dangerous. Survival required everyone to contribute. While most women likely focused on farming, textiles, and household management, a warrior culture that valued martial skill didn't necessarily restrict those skills by gender. A woman who could fight might be as valuable in defending a settlement as a man. The shield maidens have become powerful symbols in modern culture, appearing in TV shows, video games, and novels. And while popular representations may exaggerate their numbers and roles, the core truth remains: in the Viking Age, some women chose the path of the warrior. And archaeology is finally giving them the recognition they deserve. In the harsh deserts and mountains of the American Southwest, the Apache people fought a decades-long war against first Mexican and then American expansion. Among their most formidable warriors was a woman named Gozen, a fighter, a strategist, and a spiritual visionary revered by her people. Gozen was born into the Cheyenne band of the Apache in the 1840s, sister to the famous Chief Victorio. From childhood, she displayed talents that set her apart. According to Apache tradition, she underwent the rituals that marked girls' transition to womanhood, but she also trained in the arts of war, riding, shooting, tracking, and fighting. She chose the path of the warrior, and her people accepted that choice. Gozen was more than just a fighter. She was said to possess spiritual powers, including the ability to sense the location and movement of enemies. Apache tradition holds that she would stand with her arms outstretched, palms up, and slowly turn in a circle until she felt a tingling in her palms that indicated the direction of danger. Whether this was a genuine spiritual gift or a remarkably developed intuition, her people trusted her implicitly. During Victorio's War, 1879 to 1880, Gozen fought alongside her brother and his warriors, participating in raids and battles against Mexican and American forces. She was respected not just as Victorio's sister but as a warrior in her own right, someone who could be counted on in a fight, who could lead when leadership was needed, and who would never abandon her people. One of the most famous stories about Gozen involves her role in protecting women and children during a desperate escape. When Victorio's band was being pursued by the U.S. cavalry, he assigned Gozen to escort a group of women and children to safety while the warriors held off the soldiers. For days, Gozen led them through harsh terrain, finding water, avoiding patrols, and keeping everyone alive. She delivered them safely to the Mescalero Apache reservation, then returned to rejoin the fight. After Victorio was killed in 1880 by Mexican forces, Gozen continued to fight alongside other Apache leaders, including Nana and Geronimo. She was present during Geronimo's final campaign and was with him when he finally surrendered in 1886. Captured along with the other Apache prisoners, she was transported to a prison in Florida, far from her homeland. Gozen died of tuberculosis in 1889 at the Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama, a prisoner, exiled from the land she had fought so desperately to defend. But her memory lived on among the Apache people and, eventually, in the broader American consciousness. Today, Gozen is recognized as one of history's most remarkable warrior women. She fought not for conquest or glory, but for survival, for her people, her culture, and their way of life. In the face of overwhelming odds, she never wavered. That kind of courage transcends time and culture. For every famous name, Boudica, Tomoe Gozen, Joan of Arc, Ludmila Pavlichenko, there are countless others whose stories have slipped through the cracks of mainstream history. History, after all, was largely written by men. And when women picked up swords, rifles, or spears, they were often omitted, downplayed, or turned into myth. But make no mistake, warrior women have been there all along. Across continents, across centuries, across cultures, women have fought. Not always to conquer, but to protect. To defend their families, their cultures, their homes. Some led armies. Others fought as lone figures in resistance movements. Some were queens. Some were peasants. But all shattered the lie that war belonged to men alone. The archaeological evidence is mounting. The DNA tests are coming back. The graves of female warriors are being recognized for what they are. And with each discovery, the story of the past becomes more complex, more interesting, and more true. Today, their legacy is being reclaimed. From scholarly research to pop culture representations, the stories of these women are finally resurfacing. And each rediscovered name is a reminder, history is not just what was written. It's also what was erased. These women didn't ask to be remembered. They asked to be respected. And slowly, the world is beginning to listen.